So we're going to do a little overview of Proverbs today, and again, just an overview, sort of like what we did with the Psalms last week. The Psalms is a huge book. There's 150 Psalms in that book, and we've kind of dipped into it every so often. And I'll be safe to say that we will certainly be dipping into it when we do the book of Hebrews, because Hebrews quotes out of the Psalms an awful lot, a lot of messianic passages and so on. So, but Proverbs, we're going to be looking at it today. Again, just the kind of the factual stuff about it, and then looking at the structure of this of Proverbs. So it's interesting when you look at these things. And look at it from kind of a bird's eye point of view, you do see the point. You see the greater structure that's there, because sometimes when you read the book of Proverbs, you read very, very good kind of one-liners, and but you look at it and you go, this is rather disconnected. But life is like that. Life is sometimes a bit disconnected, and we're dealing with all kinds of things all at the same time. So parts of Proverbs are kind of these little short 1 or 2 verse things, where the righteous are like this and the wicked do that and the foolish and so on and so forth. But the first part of the book is more concise in terms of the types of things that it's dealing with. And then there's 2 sections at the end of the book of Proverbs that are written by other people. So anyway, so we'll get cracking here. Let me just in terms of the title of Proverbs, sometimes what we have in our English may not have been what it originally was. Okay, so oftentimes in the Greek Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it had different names. But Proverbs seems to be a fairly common word that's used in regard to this book. So the original name in Hebrew was Mishle Shlomo, okay, or Shlomo, which was the Proverbs of Solomon. Okay, because it starts right off at the beginning talking about the Proverbs of Solomon. Okay, so we're left kind of in no doubt as to who wrote this particular book. So, but in the Greek Septuagint, it was then talking more about wisdom, which is a very major theme in the book of Proverbs. So it was sometimes referred to as a book or a compilation or a collection of wisdom. So what Proverbs, the actual word means is should have been likened there to be like, or to resemble. So it's running comparisons. Where it would say the righteous man is like this, and the foolish man is like that. So the big word is like. Okay, so it's a comparison sort of thing. In grammar, it's referred to as a simile. All right. So now in grammar, the other word that is often associated with a simile is what's called a metaphor. And but a metaphor doesn't use the word like. If you say about somebody, they're trying not to come up with something terribly negative, but anyway, if you speak about an older person and say, "Oh, the old dog, he's an old dog." Okay, no, I'm not thinking of anybody in here. Okay, so but that's a metaphor. But if you say he's like an old dog, that's a simile. That's a comparison. So it might, one might be more better than the other. So anyway, probably kind of jumped into that one, and so. But the word also has this idea of meaning to rule or to govern. So these are a collection of words that, not only run these comparisons between the righteous and the wicked, or the wise and the foolish, but it is words that help to govern how we operate in life and how we think, to rule over us. So, Solomon asked God. God put a thing before him and says, "I'll give you whatever you ask." And so Solomon's desire was to be wise, and so God bestowed that on him, and God was pleased with that request, because he didn't ask for riches, he didn't ask for power and all those kinds of things, but because he asked for wisdom, he did get power. He did get riches and all those kinds of stuff. Unfortunately, power and riches went to his head. Okay, so I would say that the Book of Proverbs was written in his heyday. When his walk with God was good, because there's we did a studies not too long ago about the fear of the Lord in the Book of Proverbs. So now, in terms of an author, it is authors. Okay, now there's a bit of an old debate about this, because there would be a school of thought that would say Solomon wrote the whole thing. But there is, of course, Solomon, who would be the main writer for the first 29 chapters. For chapter 30 and chapter 31 are, it says the words of Agur, or the words of King Lemuel, and so on and so forth. So, but we'll look at that in a second. But these verses here really are the verses that set the stage for the Book of Proverbs. It says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles." So I have highlighted in green there 5 different, what they refer to in grammar as infinitive statements. They start with the word "to." So the first one is to know. All right. So that's the first step of any kind of gaining of knowledge, is you got to go and learn it. You got to go and know that. But what does the Book of Proverbs want us to know? Well, to know wisdom, know instruction. So these are things about applied knowledge. It's not just having knowledge. A lot of us have knowledge about a lot of things. I visit people who struggle with drink and all that kind of stuff, and some of them are really smart. Some of them know a lot of things, but there's very little application of what they're doing. So it's like, oh, I know this and I know that, and big whoop. Where's that sitting with you? So part of Proverbs is to know wisdom and instruction, and then it's to perceive the words of understanding. So that's about how you say and understanding what you say. So again, it's not just having sight, because you could see something but have no idea what it is. One of the magazines I had when I was growing up was a magazine called World, and it was printed by the National Geographic, and it was kind of like a kid's National Geographic. And on the back page, they had 9 different photographs, and it was called "What in the World?" And so, but they were things where you either saw stuff from a distance, from a strange angle, or it was really zoomed in, almost microscopic, And so it could have been looking at feathers of a bird, but like looking at a feather. Could have been, stars in the sky. It could have been a volcano taken from straight down or something. So it was all these pictures that when you looked at them as they were, you were scratching your head. It's like, what is this? And of course, the answers were upside down at the bottom of the page, to tell you what these things were. And so, as a kid of 10, 11, or whenever I was getting that particular thing, always had fun trying to figure out, what these things were. So, so you can see stuff, but not understand. So the Bible is saying that what we need to do is we need to perceive the words of understanding. And then verse 3 there says to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity. So if you're going to receive something, that means you don't got it. Okay. So the thing that we're going to need to receive is instruction of wisdom. Why do we need that? Because we're foolish. So we need wisdom to receive that. We need to receive justice. Why? Because we are generally unfair people. So judgment, this is the ability to discern between various things. The world today, right's wrong and wrong's right. So there, and there's a lot of gray. So whatever makes you feel good, fine, do it. So, but the Bible has things to say about how do you weigh this up, and then it talks about equity. Again, that's talking about fairness, but being level in terms of how you deal with things, not being disingenuous and inequitable in terms of how you're dealing with life and people. So you have to know, to perceive, to receive, and as you receive, then you have wisdom to give. So because God doesn't want you to take all this information and just hoard it, he wants you to then give it out. So he says there in verse 4, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man, knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain counsel. So part of our responsibility with this is to give this out. But you can't give it out until you got it, okay? Until you have it yourself. So you have to know it, you have to perceive it, you have to understand it, you have to receive it, and then you're able to give it. And then verse 6 there, it says to understand a proverb and an enigma, like a puzzle, words of the wise and their riddles. So the acquiring of wisdom is an ongoing thing. So that's what I get out of these verses, is that there's an initial step that you do with these things. You seek to know it, you seek to understand, you get it so you can give it, but it is every day is a school day. So it's always seeking then to understand what is going on, and especially maybe somewhat confusing things. And this is why Solomon talks about an enigma. So anyway, so that's the start of Proverbs. That's how things are pitched initially, and this is what the entirety of the book is built on. Okay. Now, some of the information that I have here is taken from the Bible Project, which if you Google Bible Project, you'll find their website, bibleproject.org, and they have all these wonderful videos. They're kind of cartoony sort of things. Used them with the Bible class this past year to do summaries of the various books of the Bible and that kind of thing. And it's very, very good. I mean, if you want to get a good grasp of understanding certain things, go and watch one of their videos. And in a space of 7 to 8 minutes, they'll cover the entirety of a book. But it is from a very bird's eye sort of point of view. So now getting back to the authors here, Proverbs 30 and verse 1, it says, the words of Agur, the son of Jacob, his utterance, this man declared to Athiel and Ucal. So now, Agar not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, so we don't know who this man is, but we'll talk about him a little later on after we get through some other things. So just put a bookmark there. Then there's Proverbs 31:1, the words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him. So many of you might know that Proverbs 31 is about the godly woman. So we'll be looking at that a little bit later on as well. So you have these two other men that are mentioned, and they're not anywhere else in the Bible, these people. So it's kind of curious. But anyway, these particular areas or these particular chapters do deal with some very specific things. In terms of a date for the book, it was in the 900s BC by Solomon. So I can't say exactly. King David would have been about 1000 BC, about 1010, something like that. Solomon then would have been sort of the early, well, would have been sort of maybe 980, 970, something like that. That's why I say the 900s. But he would have been the one that would have been bringing together this compilation of Proverbs. And so Solomon was, it's said in the scriptures that Solomon wrote, thousands of these things. He wrote 1,000 songs and then did Proverbs of all sorts, shapes, and sizes. So there's a lot that we don't have, but God and his sovereignty hold these particular things together in this library. It was edited between 729 and 686 BC by King Hezekiah's men. So Hezekiah's, if we remember that particular study about him, he was a man that brought great reform. The Israel came back to the Lord in a very, very strong way, and Hezekiah had a great spiritual mandate, and so he gathered various sorts of men around him to get the old books of the law and other sorts of material together. So they got into the Proverbs and kind of finalized it. Now, getting into the structure of the book, there is the introduction that we did look at some of it. We looked at verses 1 through 6, but basically 1 through 9 is this kind of intro to the book. But chapters 1 through 9 is sort of the first section. The Book of Proverbs is generally chopped up into two broad big sections, with the exception of chapter 30 and chapter 31. Okay, they're different sorts of things, but the first 9 chapters contains 10 speeches from a father to a son. So there's 10 sorts of discourses in there. The one that I would be sort of most familiar with is when the father is speaking to the son in chapter 7, and he says, "Look, son, make this word the apple of your eye. Call wisdom your sister. And embrace these things." And so the father is saying to the son, "Look, you need to do this because this is going to keep you away from the immoral woman." So Proverbs does deal with a lot of issues contemporary to that day, but they're all very contemporary now too, and that is, dealing with relationships, dealing with your community, dealing with those in authority, and so on. So, but this particular one in chapter 7, Solomon, writes in very, very clear language. I mean, you can nearly see what he's doing. where he talks about this young man who's Solomon is looking out his window and he sees a young man kind of running around out in the streets, and then he goes and kind of poking around, and he sees this young fella go down toward a corner and toward a place where there was a harlot, where there was an unsavory sort of woman, and probably hoping that he'd get turned around or something like this, but he doesn't. He gets siphoned off into the world of that woman because she says, "Look, come to bed with me. My husband's away. He's not coming back for a long time. So sure, let's enjoy ourselves." So Solomon writes about all these sorts of things, and at the end of that chapter, he would say, the young fella didn't know it would cost him his life. And so there's a lot of very somber sort of elements in these 10 speeches that the father gives to a son. Wisdom and fear of the Lord lead to virtue, integrity, and generosity, which then subsequently lead to success and peace. So again, in these first 9 chapters, these are the kinds of things that are discussed. So we start with wisdom, fear of the Lord. If we go back to our discussion about the fear of the Lord, a lot of those things were all packaged up in those early chapters, where the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, fear of the Lord's fountain of life, and so on and so forth. And the reason those things need to be there is because that leads to a stability in life, which is you're virtuous, you have integrity, and you're generous to the poor, because that you're living in a community where there's a lot of variation. And then this can lead, and the reason I say can lead is because it's not necessarily a guarantee, okay, to success and peace. Now, it does talk about then the folly and the evil, those that are foolish, those that are wicked people. Well, their lifestyles, which is kind of like the wheat and the tares. There's you have the right people, and then you have the bad people, and they're all mixed in society here, and that's why Proverbs kind of jumps around backward and forward between all these things. And so folly and evil, well, that leads to selfishness and pride, which then subsequently leads to ruin and shame. So in those chapters, this is generally what you see, especially in these 10 speeches from a father to a son. And back to chapter 7, because the young man foolishly went down to your woman's house and got caught up in that, that went bad. That led to ruin and shame. But the father was setting the stage early on in that chapter, saying, look, if you have the word of God, have the scriptures, have wisdom woven into you, well, then the opposite is going to take place. You'll be virtuous, you'll have integrity, you'll be generous, and you'll have success and peace. Then there's 4 poems of, we can talk about her as Lady Wisdom, because wisdom is often personified from a female sort of perspective. So you have and again, dealing with a lot of different sort of community, relational sorts of things. So the book of Proverbs really is God's invitation to learn wisdom from the previous generations, because what Solomon is doing is he is, kind of hearkening back, to, history, the scriptures, that kind of thing. Now, what's kind of odd, though, and I'll explain this here in a couple minutes, is that you don't see actually a great emphasis on the word of God in the book of Proverbs. It's kind of, because he doesn't really talk much about the law. He doesn't talk anything really much about the writings. He certainly talks about the fear of the Lord, and he talks about, doing right things and good things and so on, which are all very biblically informed. But in terms of actually talking about the Bible, he doesn't say much about that. So now I remember learning that, and I thought to myself, well, that was kind of typical of Solomon. Solomon was a man that was supposed to, as a king, according to Deuteronomy 17, he was supposed to write out a copy of the book of the law in his own hand. And there's no record that he ever did that. So, and it says in Deuteronomy 17 that when you get a king, the king is not to amass horses to himself, nor buy horses from Egypt. Solomon did that. He was not supposed to amass wealth to himself. He did that in spades. And he was not supposed to multiply wives to himself. And he really did that. He got 700 wives and 300 concubines. God help him. Thousand girls, So anyway, holy nuts. So, but so it doesn't bear thinking about. But anyway, so but then so those were the negative things. Basically, those are the things that this king was not supposed to do. But the thing that he was supposed to do, the positive thing, was to write out a copy of the Word of God in front of the priests. There's no record that he did that. So the Book of Proverbs, the conclusion then that I sort of came to was like, okay, well then the Word of God really wasn't terribly important to him. But I don't think that's really the case. I think, as you learn about Solomon, you learn about what Proverbs really is about, the Word of God is desperately important. So anyway, so wisdom is not the law and it is not prophecy. This is what is the Book of Proverbs, along with the Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, are what is referred to as wisdom literature. Okay, so there is those things. There is the law, which is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then there is the historical books, which would be Joshua, up through to Esther. Okay. And then there's the prophetic books, which is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and then comes Malachi. So anyway, but that's prophecy. Okay, that's speaking into the future. That's talking about God's judgment against the wicked, and talking about the blessing of those who follow God, and so on. But the wisdom literature is not making reference to the law. It is not making reference to prophecy. It is talking about how do you live your life. So when you look at the Psalms, you look at the emotional life. When you're looking at the Proverbs, you're looking at sort of the more intellectual life. When you look at Ecclesiastes really is about the man who doesn't really want to follow God. So it's about man's wisdom, but the folly of it. And then the book of Song of Solomon, which is an interesting book in and of itself. The word God isn't even mentioned in that particular book, but that is very much about a relationship between a man and a woman. I think there's 3 main characters in there. I think there's the young fella that the girl really likes, and then there's the other guy who has lots of money, and he's trying to chase after the girl too. But he's coming with boxes of chocolates and flowers and all kinds of stuff, and you're the only girl for me, even though he's running around after all sorts of people. So but it's about a proper relationship between a man and a woman. So and really, spiritually, a lot of people sort of distill that book down to just a spiritual kind of level, which is, well, what it's about is Christ's love for the church, and that's what that's about. Yes, understand that, but I think too, it's about a man and a woman and their love for each other. So now, again, all these things are connected spiritually because, as we know from the New Testament, that the marriage relationship, love between a man and a woman, is a spiritual demonstration of Christ's love for the church. So That's why marriage is under so much attack, in this day and age, especially, So, as I think about the the things that are at the top of the world's agenda in terms of promotion is gay marriage, trans rights, abortion. And I was talking to a guy yesterday about assisted suicide. These are the main things. And really, what it attacks is it attacks spiritual, very, very deep spiritual values of Christ's love for the church. The enemy of God hates that. So he will do anything and everything to try to undermine that whole concept. So anyway, so getting into the second sort of bulk of the book here, 10 through 29. Well, this is really hundreds of ancient proverbs dealing with all manner of life issues. And so when you read through those particular chapters, it is pretty hodgepodgey. It looks like it jumps around a fair bit. Well, it does. And as a man said to me one time, why is Proverbs like this? Why isn't it all kind of divided up into nice little, outline and chunks and all that kind of stuff? He says, well, but this is what life's like. There's just, a lot of different things happening. We're not just dealing with one thing in life at a time. We're dealing with a whole pile of things. Lots of stuff in our head, lots of stuff going on at church, lots of stuff, going on at work or school or, whatever. So, so the Proverbs are then dealing with all manner of things. So, but the Proverbs speaks really of probabilities. Okay, so when it's talking about, when the righteous do this, these things happen. When the folly do this, this happens. Really, it is because of life and because of the nature of life, and we all know this. There's people that do the right things. And the Bible talks about they'll have a long life if they, success and all that kind of thing. Do they always survive? Do they always live? No, they don't. So there's probabilities there, but not guarantees. So we say that and the next thing here, Proverbs are not promises. Okay, there's no guarantees in regard to life. But if you do what the book says, you do what the Proverbs tell you, in all likelihood, they'll work with you. So one of the Proverbs that I always used, and I've talked about this in the past sometimes, is Proverbs 15:1, which says, a soft answer turns away wrath. That works. And really, it does work every time unless you sort of hedge your bets on it. So, in fact, I was speaking with a man there recently just about communication between him and his wife. And it's amazing how much gets conveyed by tone. I said, look, you can say certain things to your wife, but don't say them in a patronizing way. Because as soon as you start sounding like you're patronizing her, she'll go, to blow up, So even though the information might be accurate, it might be correct. So there's a lot of things about how these sort of things worked. When I told this story before, but when I was working in the defense industry and working on the phones, and employees could ring in to get help with their computer problems. When the network was down, that was a bad day, because everybody was ringing in. We had 9,000 employees to deal with. So, and we had a team of 7. So, so they would, this one particular day where the network was down, I just got an earful, from some engineer, who, wanted to do his work. And there was a lot of sections of this company that was doing top secret stuff, because they built radar for fighter jets and bombers and, all these sorts of things. I knew the guy that actually helped design the uh, the defensive radar for the B-2 bomber, and which is referred to as the bone. And so what he did was he designed this thing so that the plane could fly at Mach 1, which is, at the speed of sound, at 200 feet above the ground without crashing. Now, that's a hard thing to do because you get a lot of reverberation off of the ground. So I remember my brother and I, when you're young and foolish and do stupid things, I think it was back in 1979 when we had a big snow and a big freeze in Washington, D.C. We thought it'd be good fun to run across the river, to run across the Potomac River. So we found a spot on the Potomac River where it all looked like ice, clear across the other side. So there's about a half a mile worth of ice. And so we stepped on the ice, and the Potomac River is a tidal river, meaning that the tide goes in and out. So the ice was actually buckling, up under the bank. And so you had to step over a lot of buckled ice to get onto the river. And so we got out into the middle, and then just a couple of miles downriver is National Airport, where jets would fly in. So the pilots hate flying in the National Airport because they have to follow the river to get down to the airport. So they're banking around and doing all this kind of stuff in order to, get down to the runway. And they're flying low. So because they're not allowed to fly over Washington, D.C., because, if you do that, then you got shot down by the anti-aircraft that's sitting on top of the White House and all this stuff. And plus the people that live in Arlington, which is where I would have lived, nobody wanted planes flying over them, because they had big houses and fancy stuff, So I was like, we don't want airplanes. So they all had to follow the river. And so, of course, my brother and I are out in the middle of this ice. And then the sound from the jets were about 150 feet above us, and just boom, 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 boom. And so the whole ice was just going, and so we ran. So anyway, yeah, Proverbs aren't promises, they're no guarantees anyway. So now Proverbs focus on the general rules of things, not necessarily the exceptions. Okay, there's a lot of exceptions in life. There's a lot of things that happen that are extraordinary, that are outside of the norm and that kind of thing. But what the Proverbs cover is, dealing with the general rules of things. Now, I have to go back to my story about the ice, because that was from the story about another thing. I was going down some rabbit hole there, so I just remembered what I was doing. I was talking about the verse in Proverbs 15:1, soft answer turns away wrath. So we got a call from one of the employees in the company, and he was irate. And he was effing and blinding, and it was just lethal. So now, I was a Christian. Honestly, I felt like going, I dead on, click, if you're going to be abused like that. Or I could have reciprocated in kind, which wouldn't have been a very Christian thing to do. I say, oh, you want to F and blind me? Well, I'll do the same to you. So, and that would have just escalated a whole big fat mess. So, but that verse was woven and integrated into my being. And so I referred to him as sir. I said, sir, if you allow me to explain what's happening, I hope you'll understand what's going on. And I was just dead level. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sound like a mouse. I was authoritative when in my speaking, but I wasn't authoritarian. All right. So and see, at the end of that conversation, that guy was groveling and there on his knees on the other end of the phone going, man, I'm so sorry that I treated you like that. So, so the soft answer dealt with wrath. So, and we think sometimes that we can be big people and say, well, okay, if they're going to, use language with me, I can, up the game here. And that doesn't help it, so, so when you do the word of God, I didn't I knew that that was a principle which would govern my language. Did I know that it was going to work as a guarantee? Not necessarily, but it's what God wanted me to do. So, I mean, the guy could have continued to chew my face out, but God loves to get behind His word, and because it's His word and His word works, you know, and that's why Proverbs speak about probabilities, not possibilities. Okay, so probability is more likely it'll work. Possibilities, well, it's kind of within the 50-50 chance kind of stuff. Now, chapter 30 is this verse here about Agur. So now, Agur identified himself as not a wise man. He looked at himself and says, I struggle. I have problems. I don't know these things. I'm a bit of an old animal when it comes to trying to get it. But he is what Solomon would have envisioned as the type of person that should read Proverbs, because people that struggle with folly, people that struggle with doing wrong things, they need to read this book. And and when you understand yourself, you're then able to receive. But if you don't really understand yourself, you then deflect. So Agur is a model reader as he understands himself as lacking wisdom, but God speaks to him through the scriptures that wisdom may be found. Now, there's a school of thought here where some people think, now you would see this in Strong's concordance. So now Strong's concordance, for those of you who don't know, is the most comprehensive book describing every word in the Bible. Okay, so it's a big, thick volume. If you have you have one. So and I now a lot of people who have computers, they have Strong's concordance and all that kind of stuff on their systems. But I remember growing up, I had it too. Big, thick thing, and you could look up any English word out of the King James, and find out where it was in the Bible. It would give the reference, and then it would give the number of what that word was, and then you could look in the back and get the definition of that particular word. So now, if you were looking for a particular phrase, it was a bit hard going, because it was divvied up into just kind of single word things. So, but they did have all the mentionings of the word the, okay, and all the a and but and then, and some of these short words that we kind of regard as somewhat innocuous and kind of useless, but every word is in the concordance. So, but what the Strong's Concordance would say in regard to Agur is, it says it's another name for Solomon. Now that's commentary. Okay, that is speculation. It is possible that that's true. Sometimes people did that back then. They would identify themselves as a different name in order to sort of kind of paint a different kind of persona. It's almost like having a pseudonym, a pen name. So I always thought, if I was ever to write a book, I wouldn't sign it as Sherwood Price. I would have S. Gerritsen Price, because Gerritsen's my middle name. So it's not a pseudonym, really, but nobody really knows my middle name, so, but it sounds a bit more regal, don't you think? S. Gerritsen Price, there we go. So, but there's other writers that have pen names, so for instance, Mark Twain was not Mark Twain. Mark Twain was something else. Can't remember what he was, unless somebody knows. So, so Agur could have been like a pen name for Solomon, but we don't know that necessarily. So now Agur, that name means gathered, and Jacob, which was his father, because it says Agur, the son of Jacob. So, and we know Solomon was the son of David, but anyway. Jacob means to obey or to be blameless. So if you take those ideas and incorporate it into the idea of Proverbs, Agur was a man that gathered information to himself, gathered knowledge to himself, so that he could obey God, so that he could be blameless before God. So it might be one of these things where in the names, that's really the reasons why this thing is mentioned, even though we know nothing about this man outside of it. But he does mention Ithiel and Ucal. Almost sounds like UCAS, like a little university portal system in the UK. But anyway, so Ithiel means God is with me or God has arrived. And Ucal simply means devoured. Now, when I look at that, I think, okay, what Agur is doing here, gathering information, gathering knowledge, gathering wisdom, so that it could be skillfully applied, so that he obeys, he's blameless. What does he want in his life? God to be with him. And now this idea that God has arrived is like, there's, sometimes with your walk with God, you don't know God that well, but in the process of time, you know God better, so then God is coming, God is landing on your doorstep. And but this other fellow, Ucal, meaning devoured, it's almost like, and the way I look at this word is not in a negative way, because sometimes when we hear that particular term, devour, it's like, but I think it's more of I'm consumed, with these things I've gotten from God. Because God is with me, because God has arrived, my appetite is about the things of God, and I devour that. I love it. I eat as much as I can of it. So I think this particular chapter is then very much informed by this kind of sentiment here. Now, chapter 31, which is the last chapter of Proverbs, incidentally, if you're ever stuck for reading something out of the Bible on a given day, just pick whatever day it is and go to that chapter of Proverbs. So today's the 22nd. Is that right? 22nd. So today's the 22nd. So go to chapter 22 in Proverbs and read that. Now, don't try to memorize the whole thing. Don't try to understand everything that's going on. God might just highlight to you a verse. So when I was in high school, I remember I did that for a period of a month, as I went through one chapter a day, and I just wrote down what particular verse God highlighted to me, and I wrote it in a book. So there's this man called Lemuel, who's a non-Israelite king. Okay, however, his name means for God. So it's a very Hebrew-y sounding name, because L on the end of any sort of name means God. But the reason the people would refer to him as a non-Israel king is because there ain't no king of this name in any of the northern tribes or Judah. So some people would say, well, obviously this was somebody outside of that. But again, could be a symbolic name for Solomon. So another kind of pen name. Now, what this particular chapter is about a wise woman, and it's an acrostic poem, which means that it is ordered by the alphabet. So the first verse in this particular section would have a line that starts with a word that starts with the letter Aleph, and then the second verse of this section would start with a word that starts with the letter Beit, and so on and so forth. So, but this is about a wise woman. This is about a woman that has Lemuel was taught by his mother. So, and when you look at mothers in the Bible, because it talks a lot about mothers, these kings that were born, they had moms, and oftentimes their names are mentioned. And when you look at the names of those particular mothers, especially of the ones that did well, good kings, their names meant some really good stuff. But you see the names of some of the other moms. Oh boy. So, but this particular Lemuel, he was taught great things by his wise mother for God. Now, it's interesting that chapter 31 has this great chapter about this wise mother speaking to her son. And then a lot of the rest of Proverbs is, guess what? About a father talking to his son. So there's this whole family dynamic of how important it is to have a mom and a dad, if that's possible, to be having influence on the children. So this particular section deals with the issues of work, relationships with spouse and children, and community. So what we're going to do in the last sort of lot of minutes here is we're going to look at this particular wise woman section, which is verses 10 through 31. This is to the end of the book, and identify, well, what are things in relation to work or merchants, okay? What it has to do with relationships with spouse, husband, what has to deal with relationships with children, and what has to do with relationship with community. So, verse 10 says, who can find a virtuous wife, for her worth is far above rubies. Now, this is obviously about the relationship that a husband has with this wife. So, and this wife, from his perspective, has great worth, and so there's this whole idea of valuing your spouse. And because from his perspective, she is worth far above rubies. So, so we're talking here about her worth and within the relationship. I deal with couples and deal with families where the relationships between husband and wife or partners, or however they term it now, is so flaming toxic. It's just hard going. And trying to get the Christian person within the relationship to handle the non-Christian who's very antagonistic or something, or whatever. It sometimes is a head scratcher, but it is then taking the word of God and applying these principles. There's a guy I was dealing with the other day, and I says, there's a verse in First Peter that says, "Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way." So my wife's from a different culture. Your all's culture, not my culture. My culture is different from yours. So now I've been here half my life, so I think I know a little bit about the culture here. But that was difficult in the early days of our marriage. It's like she did things and I did things. I was like, "Why do you do those things? That's stupid." And now that's bad tone. That's being patronizing and all that kind of stuff. And so you had to learn that that was not a place to go, especially with Belfast women. So but anyway, wind your neck in, wee lad. So like that. So, Now, verse 11 here, again, this talks about a relationship with the husband. It says, the heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. So, again, sometimes, the man in the relationship, he doesn't trust anybody. He wouldn't entrust the wife with maybe much of anything other than to cook the dinner. So, but yet this man, the heart of this husband, he safely trusts her. Says, look, you're very good at doing various sorts of roles and so on, and I trust you with those things. And it says he will have no lack of gain. Verse 12, she does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Again, I see oftentimes the opposite of this. She does him evil and not good. But what the book says is he does him good and not evil. All the days of her life. There's a great commitment to the aspiration of good and right. She seeks wool and flax and willingly works with her hands. Now this gets into things maybe in regard to work, occupation. So the main thing that she does is she goes out, seeks these materials, and she is willing to work with her hands. Now, spinning wool and dealing with flax in order to produce linen is hard work. Now, I don't think anybody here remembers the days of the linen mills, back in the 1800s and all that kind of stuff. The flax was grown, in good old Irish soil, and the reason it was good for making linen was because of its very stringy bits that came out of the ground. So, but it was hard work pulling the flax out of the ground, because it was just had such a high tensile strength. So and then what they would do is they would take your flax and they would lay it out in the field and dry it. And then they would, slice it up and do what they needed to do and put it into their, weaving machines to produce, what was, great linen. So there was, hard work involved with that. Spinning wool. I remember my aunt, she had a spinning wheel. And she took great delight all the time just spinning wool and then knitting jumpers and doing all this kind of stuff. She spun all of her own yarn. As a kid, I was like, oh, whoa, this sounds great. So you're, you got the little treadle and you're tapping it like this, and that causes the thing to spin, and it spins the spindle, and you're feeding the thing the wool, and you have all this wool, and you think this is great crack. After about 5 minutes, you're going, no, I'm ready for a break, but yeah. So, but the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31, she's not afraid of work. So verse 14, she is like the merchant ships. She brings food from afar. So we're not just talking about chips and chicken nuggets here. We're talking about, getting some fancy stuff, Yeah, that's it. I know. Don't go to Tesco, go to Marxies, but it's interesting. Here's a simile. Okay. She's not a merchant ship. Okay. If she was a merchant ship, that would be a metaphor. But she is like, so that's a simile. She is like the merchant ships, merchant ships, go out on the high seas and they spend a lot of energy and resource going to get valuable stuff. Well, she's prepared to do that. And then verse 15, she also rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and a portion for her maid servants. So this is about really not only the relationships within the house, but it is also dealing with her maid servants, which she is then acting as an employer and dealing with her employees. So and concerned about them in terms of not only does she provide for her household, but she provides for, people that are obviously in service to her. So in verse 16, she considers a field and buys it. From her profit, she plants a vineyard. I mean, the husband doesn't have anything to do with this.
We're gonna say, where would I get a woman?
Okay, yeah. So, she's the one that goes out. She considers a field. She's the one that's got the money, and she buys it. So.
Yep. If I don't tell me that I know.
Is it the vineyard? For real?
No, everything else that goes along with it.
So, and that, and so she's doing a bit of wheeling and dealing here. It's because she's getting a profit, and then she goes and plants her vineyard. So. Look, the Bible says, live with your wife in an understanding way. Now, she might hit you with a 2x4 if you're going to go down that road. So, verse 17, she girds herself with strength and strengthens her arms. So she's looking after herself, in terms of, making sure that she physically is okay, that she mentally is okay. And, when you do look after your strength, you do feel better generally. If you're going to be a couch potato, well, you're going to act like a slob, or saying, yeah, more crisps, where's my burger? Anyway, so I want a super chip. So anyway. So, but you can nearly see this one. She girds herself with strength and strengthens her arms. It's like some kind of shemale or something. But she perceives that her merchandise is good and her lamp does not go out by night. So again, she's committed to her work. She's making sure that what it is good. What did Cain do? See, Cain in the early days, he brought a sacrifice to God, but it was rubbish. Not only because it wasn't a lamb, which it should have been, but he just brought some of
What was handy?
What was handy. Yeah. So, but here we have this woman that says perceives that her merchandise is good. How do you understand that your merchandise is good? Well, you inspect it, and you know it.
Very much in very ways.
Yeah. So, and her lamp doesn't go out by night. So she's, committed to seeing the process through. I've been involved in work where, if you're told, if you start something, you finish it. Now, I was one of these people in the early days where I would go, yeah, start something, and then get bored with it or fed up or something like that. And then you go, sure, and then you walk away from it. And it's not done. Guess what? The boss person then comes and says, is it done? No. So, and you're kind of, no. So verse 19, she stretches out her hands to the distaff. I'll explain that in a minute. And her hand holds the spindle. Now, I didn't even know what this meant, so I had to look this up. So a distaff is another piece of the loom. Okay, so the spindle, is the thing where the yarn, comes off, and the distaff is kind of like the shuttlecock, that goes between the things. So so it's a piece of that weaving contraption. So. Stretches out her hands to that thing, so that, you're being quite comprehensive in how you're dealing with your stuff. You're not just focusing on the one aspect of your craft. You know your whole craft, and you hold the spindle so you keep the thing steady, and however that kind of contraption works.
I worked for a while in London.
Yep. So you saw these things then.
The women, it wasn't noisy. The
Uh-huh.
women learned to read lip read.
Yep. Yes,
to the crash, the middle school back and forth.
yeah, yeah. So, imagine back then you probably didn't have much ear protection.
No,
None.
no, I wouldn't even mention.
Yeah,
The roads, yeah.
I know he's a real comedian, you know. So, anyway, verse 20, so she extends her hand to the poor, yes, she reaches out her hands to the needy. So this is talking about community. So we've had verses here talking about relationships within the home, with husband in particular. We're now, and then we talked about her merchandise, her work. And now she extends her hand to the poor, yes, reaches out her hands to the needy, meaning she is reaching out to the community. Okay, so she's very much involved in that. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household is clothed with scarlet. So, and yeah, that's an interesting word there, snow. So, and for all household is clothed with scarlet. Now, to be honest, I've read through these things, but didn't digest everything. So I'll not make too much comment about this verse because I don't know. Okay, I'll look it up later. So she makes tapestry for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. So and again, she's one that understands these processes of making money, doing work, doing craft, and really as her reward. I mean, she's not just going to wear kind of old bog standard stuff. She is now clothed in fine linen, which comes from the flax, and purple, and purple. If you remember Lydia in the New Testament, she was a seller of purple. Purple was a very expensive color. Okay, it was interesting colors. Back in the days, we have printers and we can print any flaming color that we want to. And on your computer screen, you have 16.8 million different colors that can be displayed, on your screen. So does anybody know what all those colors are? No, I don't. But back then, if you wanted a certain color, you had to go and find some berry or some sort of natural source that would make for that color. And sometimes you just couldn't get it, or you didn't have the money to buy it. So purple was a very seriously expensive color, and that's why purple was associated with royalty. So, but it's interesting in God's economy. Sure, you can get any color you want, from the rainbow. It's all there. So He has all the colors, But in terms of you getting a certain color, sometimes you had to go and spend a lot of money. So, verse 23, her husband is known in the gates, getting back to her husband, when he sits among the elders of the land. So, I think the husband is able to exercise leadership, and this is what this is about. He's known in the gates because it was at the gate, which is where you had the conversations, you had the judgments, you had all the things that the people that had responsibility and authority would meet and do. So at least he knows that things at home are fine. They're okay. And so he can go and exercise leadership as he needs to in the community. And then 24, she makes linen garments and sells them and supplies sashes for the merchants. So again, more comment about the working away, strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. So kind of interesting, it's not to her, work is not just work. It is something that then gets fed into the personality of who she is. And so those things then demonstrate themselves in strength and honor. Those are the things that people really see. Okay. verse 26, she opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. So this is starting to get into some areas of more of character traits and such, because now when she speaks, it's not just about, knowledge, it's about this applied knowledge, how this wisdom is worked and used. And her tongue, whatever she says, demonstrates a law of kindness. And is that true of ourselves? Is what comes off our tongue those things of kindness? Is it governed by a law of kindness, or is it governed by a law of something else? Verse 27, she watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. So she's always very cognizant of what is and aware of what is going on. Verse 28, her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. It's kind of interesting. I'm just thinking here, back before I was a Christian, I remember for some reason digging this verse up. I knew nothing about the Bible. I didn't know anything about anything remotely godly, but I wanted to write my mother a card, and I found this verse, and I liked it, and I wrote it out for her. So it's interesting, that God, even in the early days, causes you to grasp certain things. And because, as I think about my BC days, before Christ days, there was times where, God had taken the word, from TV programs, finding this, other sorts of sources, and God kind of dropped them in my lap and said, look, these are valuable things. You may not understand them now, but you stay tuned and they'll get there. So because I did bless my mom. I love my mom, and because when I read this particular verse, that's what I wanted to do, was to rise up and call her blessed. And then the husband also, he praised her. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. So again, just referring sort of to women generally. Two more verses. Charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. So it is, again, looking at character, and it's not just about how you act or, how you beautify yourself, because those things can be deceitful, those things can be passing. But the thing that really, really works is the fact that you fear God. That is the thing that'll be praised. And then this is how the book ends. Give her the fruit of her hands and let her own work praise her in the gates. That's about reputation. So, and one thing my aunt has always told me, she says, talking to me about reputation and having a good name, in the community. So, because I've worked with Christians within missionary and spiritual contexts who were seen, inside that bubble as the bee's knees and the cat's pajamas, but see those same men in the community, they were rogues. They were nasty pieces of work. And they were known as cheats. They were known as adulterers. They were known as just vile people. And yet they would masquerade and come into the church and say, brilliant, super, praise the Lord, and aren't you wonderful, and all that kind of stuff. I've worked with them, and it's unwholesome. So, but here the woman here, it says, let her own works praise her in the gates. So she is consistent across the board. So anyway, that's Proverbs there, and going through that last chapter a bit just to look at those things. But those are not only things that you women can aspire to, but I think it's things that us men can aspire to as well in talked with God about how that would work, but, anyway.
Then you gonna meet on the hump,
Anyway, right, yeah, I'm not on the hunt, okay, so.
I stick with the 3 dogs, I think.
Yeah, your staff is.
Cute boys. I'm gonna assess you.